The sound of boots echoed through the dimly lit corridor, each step a reminder of the decision James Monroe was about to make. The walls of the military base seemed to close in around him, as if the very structure of the building could sense the gravity of what he was about to do. Inside his cramped office, he stood alone, gripping the manila folder tightly. His knuckles ached from the pressure, but it was nothing compared to the pounding in his chest. The folder contained everything, the evidence he had painstakingly compiled over the past few months. Pages upon pages of reports, testimonies, photographs, and details so precise that no one could doubt their authenticity. It detailed Captain Ronald Harper's abuse of power, his cruel treatment of subordinates, his manipulation of the chain of command, and the illegal activities that had stained the integrity of the entire unit. James's mind raced. He had heard rumors, whispers of the captain's dark side, but those whispers had always been just that, rumors. Until now. The door to his office creaked open, and the imposing figure of Captain Harper entered without a word, his boots clicking sharply on the floor. Harper was a man who commanded respect, a man who had made his way to the top through a blend of charisma and ruthless ambition. He was tall, with a square jaw and eyes that could freeze anyone in place. But now, as James looked at him, he saw something more, something darker. "Monroe," Harper said, his voice like gravel. "What's so urgent?" "I don't have time for games." James forced a smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's important, sir. I need you to look at something." The captain's gaze flicked down to the folder James held, and without a word, he stepped forward. He took the folder from James's hand with an air of superiority, as if it were beneath him to question anything James might present. Harper opened the folder, his eyes skimming the first few pages, before pausing. James watched him closely, noting the way his fingers trembled ever so slightly as he turned to the next page. The captain was never one to show vulnerability, but the evidence in that folder had the potential to unravel everything. Harper's face hardened as his eyes fixed on a particular photograph, one taken during a routine drill several weeks ago. It showed a subordinate, a young soldier, bruised and beaten, slumped against a wall. The image was haunting, and James could practically hear the captain's thoughts as he stared at it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. Harper's face remained impassive, but his jaw clenched, his eyes betraying the slightest hint of panic. "I see you've been busy," Harper muttered, his tone venomous. "You think you're the only one who sees what goes on around here?" James swallowed, his throat dry. The words he had rehearsed in his head now felt like knives in his mouth. "I'm not trying to play hero, sir. But what's happening here, what you're doing, this can't be ignored anymore. People are getting hurt, and you're covering it up." Harper's lips curled into a smile, but there was nothing pleasant about it. "You've got guts, Monroe. I'll give you that. But guts aren't going to save you." James clenched his fists. He knew Harper could break him, could destroy his career with a single phone call, but he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. "You're threatening me?" James asked, his voice low, barely controlled. "Is that all you've got, sir?" For a brief moment, Harper seemed to lose his composure. His eyes narrowed, and his posture stiffened. The power dynamic between them shifted, and James could see the subtle cracks in Harper's facade. This wasn't the captain who had been untouchable for years. This was a man who was slowly realizing that his reign of terror might be coming to an end. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Harper said, his voice dangerous, dripping with venom. "This isn't just some little mistake. You think I got where I am by following the rules?" James's heart pounded in his chest, but he stood his ground. "I don't care how you got here, sir. What you're doing is wrong, and it needs to stop. If it takes me losing my career to make it right, then so be it." Harper's eyes flicked to the folder in his hand, then back to James. "You're a fool. Do you honestly think anyone will believe you over me? I'm untouchable. I've worked too long, too hard to let some naive soldier like you ruin everything. James took a deep breath, his mind racing. There was no going back. The evidence was irrefutable. If he went public, it would be his word against Harper's, but the truth would come out. Eventually. Harper let out a bitter laugh. You think you're the first person to try and take me down? Do you think you're special? You're just a small part of a much bigger machine. I've got friends in high places, Monroe. People who will bury you faster than you can blink. But despite the threats, James could see something in the captain's eyes, a flicker of fear. It was brief, but it was there. Harper was trying to mask it, but he couldn't hide the truth forever. If you think you can intimidate me, you're wrong, James said, his voice steady. I'm not scared of you. Not anymore. Then, without another word, he shoved the folder back at James. You've made a huge mistake, Monroe. You'll regret this. James watched as the captain stormed out of the office, the door slamming shut behind him. He stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, his heart still pounding in his chest. The weight of his decision pressed on him like 1,000 pounds. What had he done? Was this the right choice? But deep down, he knew there was no turning back. He had made his choice, and now he would have to face the consequences. The truth was out there, and it was only a matter of time before it would destroy everything Harper had worked for. But could James survive the fallout? James Monroe sat at his desk, the weight of his decision still heavy on his shoulders. The folder that had once held all the evidence of Captain Ronald Harper's corruption now lay discarded on the edge of his desk. It felt like a ticking time bomb, its presence a constant reminder that things were about to change, and not necessarily for the better. The silence in the office was suffocating. The kind of silence that pressed down on your chest, making it hard to breathe. James stared out the window, his thoughts racing. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty parking lot outside, but in his mind, there were no shadows, only the glaring light of truth, and the darkness that would come with it. Harper's words echoed in his mind. You'll regret this. You're a fool. You're nothing. But James wasn't ready to back down. He knew what the captain had done, and he couldn't live with himself if he didn't do something about it. He had seen the destruction Harper had caused to countless lives, men and women under his command who had suffered in silence, too afraid to speak up. James had been one of them. But no longer. Not after today. The problem was, he wasn't sure what came next. It wasn't as simple as just showing the evidence to someone higher up the chain. Harper was too powerful, too well-connected. The military wasn't exactly known for its transparency, and those in power weren't likely to take kindly to one of their own being exposed. James had no illusions about the consequences. He could lose everything, his career, his reputation, maybe even his freedom. The sudden sound of footsteps outside his office snapped him back to reality. He looked up just as the door creaked open. Monroe, a voice called out. It was Sergeant Karen Phillips, one of the few people James trusted in the entire unit. Her face was drawn, eyes shadowed with concern, and she was standing in the doorway as though she wasn't sure if she should come in. James knew she had her suspicions about the captain, but even she hadn't known the full extent of Harper's actions. Not until now. What's going on? Karen asked, her voice low and wary. She stepped inside, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow. James hesitated for a moment before speaking, unsure how much he could reveal. He didn't know who he could trust anymore, and every word felt like a risk. But Karen had been a good friend, and she'd always been there when things got tough. He had to tell her. Harper, he said, his voice hoarse, he's been covering up so much. So many things we don't know about. I've got proof, Karen. I have everything. Her eyes widened, and she moved closer to his desk, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "What are you talking about? You're not serious, are you? What proof? What has he done?" James opened the folder slowly, placing it between them on the desk. "This," he said simply, tapping the top of the pile of documents. "It's all there. What he's done to the men and women under his command. The abuse. The lies. The illegal activities. It's all in these papers." Karen's eyes flicked over the documents, scanning the first few pages before she went still, her breath catching. The reality of what was in those pages seemed to hit her all at once, and her face drained of color. This is bad, James. This is worse than I thought." James nodded, his stomach twisting. "I don't know what to do with it. I don't know who I can trust. Harper's got too many connections. He's been here for years. He's untouchable." Karen's face was grim. "You know what's at stake, don't you? You're talking about bringing down the whole unit. Hell, maybe the whole damn department. Harper's got more than just power here. He's got leverage. If you expose this, you might be setting yourself up for a fall." James stared at the folder. The documents had once seemed like a weapon, a tool he could use to bring justice. But now, with Karen's words echoing in his ears, it felt more like a ticking bomb, ready to explode in his face. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't live with myself if I don't do something. We've lost so many good people because of him. It's not just about me anymore. It's about everyone he's hurt." Karen looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing the decision herself. Then, finally, she spoke. "All right. We need to be careful. You can't just go out and tell everyone. There's too much at stake, and if you're not careful, it'll backfire. Harper won't go down easily." James nodded. He knew that better than anyone. "What do we do?" Karen paused, her face tense. "We need to gather more. Get more evidence, find others who've been affected. But we need to do it quietly. If Harper even catches wind of this, he'll come for both of us." Just as James was about to respond, a knock on the door interrupted. Before either of them could react, the door opened, and Lieutenant Travis Burns walked in. Burns was a known ally of Harper's, a man who had never shown much interest in doing things by the book. His cold eyes flicked between James and Karen, and there was a noticeable shift in his demeanor when he saw the folder on the desk. "Everything all right in here?" he asked, his tone casual, but there was something about his voice that felt off. James immediately felt a surge of anxiety. Could Burns be working with Harper? Was this a setup? "Everything's fine, Lieutenant," Karen said quickly, closing the folder and pushing it out of sight. She gave James a quick, almost imperceptible look before standing up. "We were just talking about the training exercises. Nothing to worry about." Burns didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press the issue. "Good. Just make sure the paperwork's in order. We don't want any problems with command." He left as quickly as he had come, but the tension in the room lingered. Karen let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That was too close," she muttered. James's mind was already racing. "Do you think Burns knows something? Could he be onto us?" Karen shook her head, her brow furrowed. "I don't know. But we have to assume that Harper's watching everyone. We have to move carefully, James. One wrong move, and it's over." The walls were closing in around him. James could feel it. The threat was real. But he couldn't stop now. Not when the truth was within his grasp. The days that followed felt like a slow descent into darkness. Every step James Monroe took felt heavier than the last, each one sinking him further into the quicksand of his decision. The evidence he had uncovered, the proof of Captain Harper's abuses, was now a constant shadow in his life, looming, threatening, and inescapable. James couldn't shake the feeling that every pair of eyes around him was watching, every whispered conversation behind closed doors was about him. Every corner he turned, he expected to see Harper's cold, calculating gaze, waiting for him to slip up. But worse than that, worse than the constant anxiety, was the growing realization that he was no longer sure who he could trust. Karen Phillips had been his only ally. She had understood the stakes, the consequences. Together, they'd begun gathering more evidence, reaching out to a handful of others who had been harmed by Harper's cruelty. But with each passing day, it was becoming clear that the walls were closing in. James's every move felt like it was under surveillance. That afternoon, he met Karen in the parking lot outside the base, under the cover of a gathering storm. The sky had turned a bruised gray, heavy clouds blocking out the sun, and the wind had picked up, swirling around them as they stood by Karen's car. "You okay?" she asked, looking at James with a mix of concern and wariness. James nodded, though the tension in his jaw betrayed him. "Just tired. We've been at this for weeks, and it feels like we're no closer to exposing him." Karen gave him a tight smile. "We will be. It just takes time. We've got the records, the testimonies, the photos. We're close." But even as she said the words, James could hear the uncertainty in her voice. The fear that neither of them were ready to admit. They were close to the edge, too close. If Harper found out what they were doing, there would be no turning back. "I keep thinking I'm just one mistake away from being caught," James confessed, his voice low. "One wrong move, and I'm done." Karen sighed, glancing around nervously as if the wind might carry their words away. "You're not alone in this. You've got me. We've got others. But we need to be careful. Every time we dig deeper, Harper tightens his grip. We've got to take it slow." James looked at her, his brow furrowing. "But how slow is too slow? If we wait much longer, we might never get a chance. Harper's not just going to let this slide. He'll do whatever it takes to bury it. You saw how he reacted last time." Karen's eyes darkened, and she shook her head. "I know. But we have to think this through. If we expose this too soon, if we go public before we're ready, he'll destroy us. There's a lot at stake here." Before James could respond, a car pulled into the parking lot, sleek, dark, and unmistakable. The black SUV with tinted windows stopped a few spaces away from where they were standing. Neither James nor Karen moved as the vehicle's engine hummed, a slight vibration traveling through the ground. James's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the car. It belonged to Lieutenant Travis Burns. He had been hanging around the base a lot more recently, and every time he was near, James felt his skin crawl. Burns was a known ally of Harper's, a man who played the system for all it was worth. And James had a gut feeling that Burns was watching them. "He's here," James murmured, his stomach tightening. "We need to go. Now." Without another word, Karen unlocked the car and slid into the driver's seat. James followed quickly, his mind racing as he slammed the door shut. The SUV remained parked, the tinted windows hiding the occupants inside. He couldn't tell if Burns was watching them directly or if they had simply become a part of his routine surveillance, but the sense of danger was undeniable. "Go," James urged, his voice tense. Karen didn't need to be told twice. She started the engine, and the car rolled out of the parking lot with deliberate ease. They drove in silence for a few blocks before James spoke again, his voice quiet but urgent. "I don't like this, Karen. I don't trust Burns." "I don't either," she replied, her knuckles tight on the wheel. "But right now, we don't have a choice. We need to keep moving, keep digging." James nodded, though his mind was elsewhere. He knew that Harper had eyes everywhere. But now, it seemed like Burns was another player in the game, a pawn, or worse, a predator circling in for the kill. Later that night, James sat alone in his apartment, staring at the pile of papers scattered across his kitchen table. The storm outside had intensified, rain battering the windows, thunder shaking the walls. He should have been resting, preparing for the next step. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Harper's cold stare, felt the pressure mounting against him. He knew he was playing a dangerous game, but it felt like there was no other choice. The truth had to come out. Someone had to stop Harper before he destroyed more lives. But what if the cost was too high? As James leaned forward, his phone buzzed on the table, breaking his thoughts. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the screen. It was a text from Karen. "We need to meet. Tomorrow. It's urgent." His pulse quickened. The words were cryptic, but there was an underlying sense of urgency in them that made his stomach churn. He typed a quick response. "What's going on?" Her reply came quickly. "Burns is on to us. I think he knows. We're in danger." James's heart stopped. Burns? How much did he know? Had their cover been blown? Before he could respond, the phone vibrated again. "We need to talk in person. Tomorrow. Don't trust anyone." The message was clear. James placed the phone down, a chill running through his spine. What had they uncovered? The situation was escalating faster than he had anticipated, and now, it wasn't just about exposing Harper. It was about survival. The next day, James and Karen met in the same secluded cafe, hidden away from the prying eyes of the base. They spoke in hushed tones, their conversation interrupted only by the soft clink of coffee cups and the distant murmur of other patrons. "We don't have much time," Karen said, her face pale. "Burns is already moving. He knows we're getting closer to exposing Harper, and I think he's planning something. I can feel it." James nodded. "What do we do?" "I think we need to go to the next level," Karen said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We need to involve someone who can't be intimidated. Someone outside the system. A journalist, maybe. Someone who can get this story out in the open." James stared at her, torn between the fear of making things worse and the need to take action. But he knew she was right. They couldn't do this alone anymore. They had to trust someone else, someone who could expose the truth. But as they talked, a new question crept into James's mind. What if Burns wasn't just watching them? What if he was already working with Harper? And if that was true, they might be walking straight into a trap. The pressure was suffocating. Every waking moment felt like a countdown to disaster, and every move James Monroe made seemed to pull him further into a game where the rules were stacked against him. The walls were closing in fast, and it seemed as though no matter how carefully they tried to play it, someone was always one step ahead of them. James sat in his cramped apartment that night, staring at his phone, weighing his options. The message from Karen earlier that day still echoed in his mind. Burns is already moving. He knows. We're in danger. The question that kept him awake wasn't just whether Burns had been compromised, it was how much Burns knew, and what he was prepared to do to stop them. It wasn't just about Harper anymore. The stakes had escalated. Now, they were dealing with a much larger web of deception. Karen had suggested they take their findings to the media, to someone who could expose the truth to the world. But could they really trust anyone outside the military? There were too many risks. What if the journalists were as compromised as everyone else? What if they couldn't trust anyone at all? James ran his fingers through his hair, frustration building inside him. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his spiraling thoughts. It was a message from Karen. "Meet at the usual place. It's urgent." James didn't hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, made sure his keys and wallet were in his pocket, and headed out the door. The usual place was a small diner on the outskirts of town, a little off the beaten path, where the flickering neon sign and the steady hum of the coffee machine provided just enough cover for two people who needed to speak without drawing attention. James arrived first, as usual, and sat in a booth by the window, his eyes darting to the door every few seconds. The last thing they needed was anyone following them here. When Karen arrived, she wasted no time sitting down. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with concern, but there was something else there too, a certain urgency that made James sit up straighter. "What happened?" he asked quietly, leaning in. "I don't think we have much time," Karen said, looking around once more, as if making sure they weren't being watched. "Burns, he's on to us for sure. He's already been talking to people. And he's not just passing information on to Harper, he's making moves. I overheard a conversation at the base. They're planning something." James's stomach dropped. "Planning something? What kind of something?" he pressed. Karen's eyes narrowed. "I don't know exactly, but I've heard rumors. They're pulling strings behind the scenes, trying to discredit anyone who's been speaking out against Harper. They're going to make sure this all gets buried. And I'm starting to think they're more connected than we realized." James clenched his fists, his mind racing. Burns was more dangerous than he'd thought. But what exactly was he after? Was he working with Harper? Or was he protecting his own interests? "We can't let them get away with this," James muttered under his breath, a sense of dread settling in his chest. "What do we do now?" "We need to act fast," Karen replied. "I've been thinking, there's someone who can help us. Someone outside the military, but with a good reputation. Someone who can help get the story to the right people, without the military getting their hands on it." "Who?" James asked, his voice cautious. "A journalist," Karen said, her eyes fixed on him. "Her name is Evelyn Roberts. She's been covering military corruption for years, and she's good at staying out of sight. I've done some digging, and I think she's the one we need to contact. She'll know how to get this to the public without Harper's people stopping us." James's pulse quickened. This was the chance they had been waiting for, the chance to bring everything into the light. But something about it still didn't sit right with him. "Are you sure we can trust her? We don't know anything about her. She could be working with Burns, for all we know." "I don't think so," Karen replied, her tone firm. "But we'll need to meet her in person to make sure. I've arranged a meeting. Tomorrow night. We have to be careful, though. I don't trust anyone, but she's our best shot." James nodded, his mind already running through 1,000 possibilities. If Evelyn was truly their ally, they could finally put everything into motion. But if she wasn't, it could be the end of everything they'd worked for. The next night, James and Karen made their way to a quiet, dimly lit cafe on the outskirts of town. They sat in the back corner, away from the main entrance, waiting for their contact to arrive. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. The shadows in the corners seemed to move with a life of their own, and every passing car felt like it was too close to their table. Finally, a woman walked in, her gaze scanning the room briefly before she made a beeline toward them. She was tall, with dark, wavy hair, wearing a simple jacket and jeans. She didn't look like a journalist, but then again, neither did they. Her presence, though, was commanding. James could tell right away she wasn't the type to be intimidated. "James Monroe, Karen Phillips," she said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. Her voice was calm but steely. "I assume you've got what I asked for." Karen slid the folder across the table to her, and the woman, Evelyn Roberts, opened it slowly, her eyes flicking over the documents with practiced ease. She didn't seem surprised by the contents, but James could see the tension in her shoulders as she flipped through the pages. She paused, her eyes narrowing on one particular document. "You've got everything here," Evelyn said, her voice low. But it's not going to be easy to get this out there. Harper's got his hands in too many pockets. You'll have to be strategic. And you'll need to move quickly. James leaned in. What's the plan? Evelyn looked at him with a calculating gaze. First, we have to make sure this is real. If we're going to bring this to the press, we need to be airtight. You've done your part, but we need to make sure the evidence is bulletproof. After that, we can start making calls. But we can't wait too long. The longer this goes on, the more likely it is Harper will find out. The tension in the room was palpable. The threat of Harper, Burns, and the military's protective grip on the truth was starting to feel like a tightening noose. James felt his chest tighten as the conversation turned more urgent. What if they were too late? What if Harper already knew what they were planning? What if their every move was being tracked? The more they dug, the more they found out that everything, their entire world, was built on lies. As they finished their meeting, Evelyn gave them a warning. I can't guarantee your safety, not in this. But I can help you expose the truth. We'll move fast, but we need to be prepared for anything. That night, as James returned to his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. His phone buzzed again, but this time, it was a different number. I know what you're planning. Don't think you can outrun me. You're already too deep. It was from an unknown number. But James knew, deep in his gut, that it was from Burns. The walls were closing in faster than he could move. The game was no longer about exposing Harper. It was about surviving it. James could feel it now, the walls closing in, the trap tightening around him. The feeling of being watched had grown unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards in his apartment felt amplified, every passing car outside his window seemed like an unwanted presence. It was the kind of paranoia that gnawed at you from the inside out, making it impossible to relax, to think clearly. The message from Burns had shaken him more than he cared to admit. I know what you're planning. Don't think you can outrun me. You're already too deep. Those words haunted him. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Burns wasn't going to let this go easily. And if he was already one step ahead, how much danger were they really in? He had to act fast. If Harper and his people had figured out what they were planning, then their window of opportunity was closing. Evelyn had told them they needed to move quickly, and she was right. They had already gathered all the evidence they could, but it had to be shared before it was too late. The next few days passed in a blur. James and Karen worked with Evelyn, gathering all the necessary pieces, preparing their story for the press. They had a plan: get everything to a trusted journalist, someone who could work quickly and get it out before Harper's people had a chance to bury it. They knew it wasn't going to be easy, but it felt like the only option left. James sat at his kitchen table one night, staring at his phone. The texts between him and Karen had become increasingly terse, the pressure weighing down on them both. She had texted earlier that she would meet him at a secluded location, away from prying eyes, to go over the final details. But as James checked his watch, a cold sense of dread settled over him. Something didn't feel right. The small, run-down warehouse on the outskirts of town had always been their meeting point, remote, deserted, perfect for private conversations. James had parked his car a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way, trying to stay out of sight. As he neared the warehouse, he noticed something unusual: a dark van parked nearby, the engine running, its lights dimmed. No one was around, but the van seemed out of place. His instincts kicked in. He was being followed. He was sure of it. He approached the door to the warehouse carefully, checking over his shoulder to make sure no one had seen him. He pushed open the creaky door, stepping inside. The warehouse was empty, save for a few scattered boxes and dusty crates. There was no sign of Karen. But the flickering lights overhead did little to reassure him. His gut told him something was wrong. He pulled out his phone to send a message to Karen, but before he could type a single word, the door slammed shut behind him. He spun around just in time to see the figure standing in the doorway. It was Lieutenant Burns. James's heart raced. Burns was here, but how? Was he tracking them this whole time? You thought you could hide from me? Burns's voice was cold, almost too calm. His eyes were narrowed, a cruel smile playing at the edges of his lips. James took a step back, his mind racing. What do you want, Burns? Oh, it's not what I want, Monroe, Burns said, taking a few steps forward. It's what you've gotten yourself into. You and your little friend. You've made a mess of things, and now it's time to clean it up. The sound of the van's engine sputtered to life outside, and James's pulse quickened. He knew they were cornered. This was it. They had underestimated Burns, hadn't anticipated how far he would go to protect his own. You don't understand, Burns, James said, trying to keep his voice steady, even though his entire body was screaming for him to run. We're doing the right thing. We have the evidence. It's all here. You can't just keep this buried. Burns laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. Right thing? You've got no idea what you're dealing with. You think exposing Harper will save you? You're not even scratching the surface, Monroe. You've made enemies, and now you're going to pay the price. James's heart raced. He couldn't let Burns intimidate him. Not now. He had come too far, and there was no turning back. You can't stop this. People will know the truth. People? Burns stepped closer, his voice dripping with disdain. The only people who will know the truth are the ones who control it. And I'm afraid you're not one of them, Monroe. Before James could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He turned just in time to see Karen emerging from the shadows. But there was something different about her, something he couldn't place. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Burns, her face a mask of calm. Burns noticed it too. Ah, so you brought her here, did you? Funny how you thought you could trust her. James's heart skipped a beat. What was Burns talking about? Karen took a step forward, her gaze fixed on Burns, and then she turned to James. Her eyes were unreadable, and for a moment, James couldn't decipher the emotion in them. James, she said softly, almost too softly, I never wanted to hurt you. But you're in too deep now. James blinked, confusion sweeping through him. Karen, what are you talking about? Burns smirked. Oh, didn't you know? Karen's been playing both sides all along. She's been feeding me information for months. You really think she's been helping you? She's been working with me from the start. The words hit James like a punch to the gut. No. That can't be true. He looked at Karen, his mind reeling, his heart pounding. She had been his ally. They had been through so much together, and now this? Karen, please, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me it's not true. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she looked at Burns and then back at James, her expression hardening. I'm sorry, James. I never wanted it to come to this, but you made it impossible. You should have known better. We were never going to win against Harper and Burns. The betrayal hit James like a tidal wave. He felt the ground shift beneath him, the weight of the entire situation crashing down on him. His world had been turned upside down, and the one person he had trusted most had just sold him out. Burns stepped closer, a triumphant gleam in his eye. It's over, Monroe. You're done. James's mind raced as everything seemed to move in slow motion. His chest tightened with panic, his vision narrowing, but then, something in him snapped. The rage that had been simmering beneath the surface broke free. You think you've won? James said, his voice rising with defiance. You think this is over? Before anyone could react, James made a split-second decision. He turned, running for the door, but Burns was faster. He lunged at James, grabbing him by the arm and throwing him against the wall. The force of the impact knocked the wind out of him, but James didn't stop. He pushed himself up, desperate, driven by the need to survive. Burns sneered, stepping back, and Karen, just stood there, watching. James could feel his heart pounding in his ears as he realized how far they had come. The truth wasn't just about the abuse. It was about survival now. And to survive, he was going to have to outwit the very people he'd trusted. The air was thick with tension, and James's breath came in short, ragged bursts. His body was aching from the blow to the wall, but he couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not when everything was on the line. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, the adrenaline coursing through his veins like fire. His mind was a chaotic mess of emotions, anger, betrayal, fear, but it was all drowned out by a single, overpowering instinct: survival. Burns was closing in, his footsteps heavy on the concrete floor, but James didn't stop running. He ducked around a stack of crates, trying to gain some distance. He had no plan, no clear idea of what he was doing, but there was one thing he knew for sure: he couldn't let Burns or Karen get their hands on the evidence. The small warehouse suddenly felt like a labyrinth, every shadow a potential threat. He could hear Burns's voice echoing in the silence, cold and taunting. "You can't escape, Monroe. You're surrounded. You'll never get out of here alive." James's heart raced faster at the sound. "I can't be caught. Not now. Not with the evidence still in my hands." His fingers tightened around the folder containing everything, the proof that could expose the entire network of corruption. He had to make it out, but the odds were stacked against him. Karen's betrayal had shattered his trust, and Burns's ruthless pursuit was only the beginning. He was alone now, truly alone. He ducked behind another stack of boxes, trying to quiet his breathing. The silence in the warehouse felt like a weight pressing down on him. His mind kept replaying Karen's words. "I'm sorry, James. I never wanted it to come to this." She hadn't even tried to stop Burns. She had simply watched as he was thrown to the ground, her cold eyes refusing to meet his. The truth hit him harder than the physical blow. She was never on his side. All this time, he had trusted her, believed she was just as committed to exposing the corruption as he was. But in the end, she had only been playing her own game, using him to get ahead. His mind raced. He couldn't afford to think about her anymore. The betrayal was sharp, but it was in the past now. He had to keep moving forward, keep pushing. There was no going back. James moved cautiously through the shadows, trying to find a way out of the warehouse. The back exit was close, but Burns was blocking the front. He could hear the faint sounds of movement outside, too, another van, engines rumbling as if waiting for him to make his next move. He wasn't just running from Burns anymore. He was running from everything that had kept him in this hellish mess, from the lies, the manipulation, and the deep, suffocating sense of being trapped. His fingers were slick with sweat as he held onto the folder, his mind turning over the one last thing he had to do: get the evidence to the press. No matter what. No matter who he had to trust. He could almost hear Evelyn's voice in his head. "Move fast, but be careful. You don't want to bring more heat on yourself. Evelyn." There was a sliver of hope left in this twisted nightmare. She was the only one who could help him now. But how could he even get in touch with her? The phone's battery was already dangerously low, and the last time they had talked was hours ago. Still, he couldn't afford to waste time. He had to act. He crept toward the back door, his breath shallow, his pulse pounding. Just as he reached for the handle, the door swung open. A shadow loomed in the doorway, blocking his escape. It was Karen. "James, stop," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Please, just hear me out." James froze, his heart thudding in his chest. "What now?" She took a step forward, her eyes scanning the room, making sure no one else was nearby. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. You need to understand. This, everything, wasn't what you think." James's eyes narrowed. His hands tightened around the folder. He couldn't trust her. Not anymore. "I'm done listening to you." "No, James. You're not getting it," Karen said urgently. "Burns is dangerous. You think you can expose Harper? You think you can just walk away from this? The truth is, you're in over your head. You don't know what you're dealing with." James stepped back, his mind racing. "You're one to talk. You were working with him the whole time." Karen's face twisted with guilt, but her voice remained calm, almost too calm. "I had no choice. You don't understand. Burns. Harper, they're part of something much bigger than you know. If you keep going down this path, it'll destroy everything. You're not just exposing one man, you're digging into something that's been covered up for decades." James's stomach churned. What is she talking about? "I know you're pissed at me." "I get it," Karen continued. "But I'm not your enemy. I'm trying to help you. If you take that evidence to the press, you won't just ruin Harper, you'll ruin yourself. You'll have the whole military on your back. You'll never escape them." For a moment, James wavered. Was this the truth? Was Karen right? Maybe it was all too big, too much for him to handle. Maybe he wasn't equipped to bring down the system that had been built over decades. Maybe he should just walk away, disappear, and try to salvage what was left of his life. But then he remembered the first time he had witnessed the abuse, the first time he had seen what Harper had done to those soldiers, the first time he had seen the suffering. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't back down now. "No," James said, his voice low and firm. "I'm not walking away. I'm taking this to the press, Karen. It's too late for me to turn back. You don't get to control this anymore." Karen's face hardened, her jaw tight. "I warned you." Before James could react, a sharp crack of gunfire echoed through the warehouse. His blood ran cold, his instincts kicking in as he dove behind the crates. The shot had come from outside the door. "James!" Karen shouted, her voice frantic. "You have to go. Now." He didn't need any more encouragement. With a burst of energy, he bolted for the back exit, his heart hammering in his chest. He could hear the footsteps behind him, growing louder, but he didn't look back. He had one shot, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. James sprinted through the alleyway, his mind consumed with the singular thought of getting the evidence to Evelyn. But the world felt like it was collapsing in on him. Every shadow felt like a threat. The streets were empty, the night air heavy with the weight of his choices. He couldn't tell who was after him, who was hunting him, but he could feel them closing in. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Evelyn. "It's too risky. Get to the safe house now." His heart raced. A safe house? The message made it sound like she had known about the danger all along, and now it was his only chance to escape the madness. He didn't hesitate. He turned and ran, following the darkened path that would lead him to safety. But with every step, he felt the weight of the truth. There was no escaping the monster they had created. The people in power weren't just going to let him walk away. And Karen's words echoed in his mind. "You're in over your head." The only question now was whether he would survive long enough to tell the world the truth. James's breath was ragged, the weight of exhaustion settling in his bones. His muscles screamed with every step, but he couldn't slow down, not now. Every footfall felt like it echoed louder in the empty streets, but his mind was fixated on one thing, Evelyn. He had to reach her. She was his only chance. The dark alleyways he sprinted through seemed endless. The night air felt colder, the shadows more oppressive. As he rounded a corner, he spotted the street he was looking for. Up ahead, the small, nondescript building loomed, a safe house. The address Evelyn had given him was now etched into his memory. It was the only place he could go, the only place where he could find refuge from the chaos swirling around him. But as he neared the building, something felt off. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. His instincts screamed at him, urging him to stop, to turn around, to find a different way in. He didn't know why, but every warning bell inside him was going off. James slowed to a cautious walk, his eyes darting around, scanning the area. He could hear nothing but the distant hum of the city, but the silence was deafening. The safe house was supposed to be secure, but in his gut, he knew, nothing about this situation was secure. Not anymore. He reached the door, his hand trembling as he knocked twice, once, twice, the way Evelyn had told him. The door opened slightly, just a crack. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway. It wasn't Evelyn. The figure, a tall man dressed in dark clothes, peered out at him through the narrow gap, his eyes flicking from side to side before resting on James. There was a brief moment of tension. Then the man spoke, his voice low and steady. "James Monroe," he said, his tone devoid of surprise. "Come in. Quickly." James didn't hesitate. He stepped into the dimly lit hallway, his heart pounding. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and the man led him down a narrow corridor. The place was sparse, clean, everything about it screamed temporary. The kind of place you use when you're trying to hide from the world. The man stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway and motioned for James to enter. "Evelyn's waiting for you." James's pulse quickened. He pushed past the man, not caring to ask questions. He had come too far to be cautious now. When he stepped into the room, his eyes immediately locked onto Evelyn, who was seated at a table, looking like she hadn't moved in hours. Her face was pale, her eyes sharp, but there was something different about her now, something guarded, like she was preparing for something. "James," she said, standing quickly. "You made it." "I came as fast as I could," James replied, though his voice trembled with the weight of the last few days. "The evidence, it's all here. It's all we need." He held out the folder, and Evelyn's eyes scanned it quickly. Her gaze flickered to the man who had let James in, and for the first time, James noticed a flicker of unease in her expression. She took the folder from him but didn't open it immediately. Instead, she looked back at the man and then at James. "Sit down," Evelyn said quietly. James hesitated for a moment, but then followed her instructions. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in. The man stood by the door, watching, his eyes calculating. "James, we need to talk," Evelyn continued, her voice low. "About everything." James frowned, his thoughts racing. What was she trying to tell him? "I don't understand," he said. "I thought you were here to help. This is our chance. We can expose them. Harper, Burns, they're all in this. This is the moment, Evelyn. We can finally do something." Evelyn exhaled deeply, a long, heavy breath that seemed to carry the weight of her words. "James, there's something you need to understand. I didn't bring you here just to hide you. I didn't bring you here to play this game anymore." James's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Evelyn sat down across from him, folding her hands in front of her. The man by the door remained silent, but James could feel his eyes on him. The air between them had shifted. "James, you've been chasing a ghost," Evelyn said. Her voice wasn't harsh, but the truth in her words hit him like a slap. "You're fighting a battle you can't win. It's bigger than you think. It's bigger than just Harper or Burns. It's bigger than anything you've imagined. James's breath caught in his throat. Bigger than I imagined? What was she saying? He shook his head. No. I won't back down now. We're this close. We have the evidence. We can take them down. Together, we can. Evelyn held up her hand to stop him. You're not listening to me, James. The system you're trying to expose? It's not just Harper or Burns. It's everything. The entire military-industrial complex. The corruption you think is just within the military? It runs deeper than that. And it doesn't matter if you expose it. It won't change a thing. They'll shut it down. They'll kill this story before it even gets out. And they'll do it through people like me. People who are so far inside the system that they can't even remember what it's like to be on the outside. James's head was spinning. His hands clenched into fists. This can't be happening. She can't be serious. You're saying we shouldn't try? He asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. I'm saying you're out of your depth, Evelyn replied, her gaze unwavering. You have no idea how deep this goes. You think Harper and Burns are the heads of the snake? They're just pawns. They've been set up to fail. It's always been bigger than them. The words hung in the air, the weight of them suffocating. James could feel the ground shifting beneath him. What do I do now? He glanced at the man standing by the door, his eyes unreadable. The man stepped forward and spoke for the first time. James, Evelyn is right. The system you're fighting against isn't something you can defeat with a few files and a few phone calls. It's a force of nature. You need to let it go. James's mind reeled. Let it go? You're telling me to quit? After everything we've been through? The man nodded slowly. We're not here to fight for justice. We're here to survive. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. James's head was spinning. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't what he had worked for. He had believed, no, trusted, that exposing the truth would make a difference, that it would change things. But Evelyn and the man in the doorway were telling him something else. The fight wasn't winnable. James's heart hammered in his chest. Every word they spoke felt like it was tearing apart the belief system he had built his life on. But he had to know more. He had to understand. Why didn't you tell me this before? James asked, his voice raw. Why didn't you tell me the truth from the start? Evelyn's face softened. Because you wouldn't have believed me. None of us do, until we're this close. But now you're too far in. You have to make a choice, James. James's mind raced. Choice. His gut told him there was only one thing left to do. The silence in the room was deafening. James sat frozen, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, emotions crashing through him like waves against the shore. Every single thing he had believed in, every ounce of conviction he had, now felt like a lie. Evelyn's words echoed in his head, you have to make a choice. He glanced at her, his partner in this twisted game of cat and mouse, but all he saw was the woman who had led him into this mess, someone who seemed just as lost as he was. Her face had softened, but there was no comfort to be found there. She was caught, just as much as he was. She had already made her choice, but James wasn't sure he was ready to make his. How do you live with this? James's voice cracked as he broke the silence. How do you live knowing that everything is corrupted, that there's no justice? How do you live knowing you're a part of it? Evelyn's eyes flickered, but she didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned away, as if looking for an answer in the shadows of the room. After a long pause, she spoke again, her voice quiet but resolute. You survive. That's all we can do, James. We survive. And if we're lucky, we find a way out. But there's no grand victory here. There's no shining light at the end of the tunnel. If you want to keep fighting, you're going to lose. The system is too big. The people at the top? Too powerful. They don't care about you, about me, or about the truth. All they care about is maintaining their grip on everything. James clenched his fists. He wanted to argue, to shout, to make her see reason. But deep down, he knew she was right. They had been pawns in a much larger game, their actions insignificant in the grand scheme of things. What could they possibly do to bring down something so vast? But there was one thing he couldn't shake, one thing that kept him from walking away. It was his sense of justice, his need to fight for what was right, no matter how hopeless the battle seemed. He had come this far. He couldn't just give up now. I'm not going to let them win, James said, his voice low but firm. I can't just walk away. If you've given up, that's your choice. But I'm still in this. I have to fight. Evelyn sighed, a deep, almost mournful sound. Then you're more naive than I thought. James stood, his legs shaky but determined. Maybe. But I'll be the one to decide that. Not you. Not anyone else. There was a beat of silence, and Evelyn's gaze hardened, the resolve in her eyes clear. She had been trying to protect him, to warn him of the danger ahead, but it was clear now that James had made up his mind. She wouldn't stop him, not anymore. But she wasn't going to help him either. The decision was his to make, and she would stand by it, even if it meant losing him. Fine, she said, her voice flat. Do what you have to do. But don't say I didn't warn you when it all comes crashing down. James didn't reply. He didn't need to. He had already made his decision. He turned and walked toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. Every step felt like a weight lifting, but at the same time, every step carried him further into a dangerous unknown. As he reached the door, he glanced back at Evelyn, who was standing in the same spot, her eyes following him. For a moment, their eyes met, two people bound by the same struggle, yet on different paths. He didn't know if they would ever see each other again. He didn't know if he would survive this. But he had to try. Outside, the world felt colder. The wind cut through his jacket, the chill gnawing at his skin, but James didn't feel it. He was numb, focused only on the road ahead. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he had to find a way to expose the truth. The truth that had been hidden for so long, buried beneath layers of deception, lies, and corruption. But there was one thing James didn't realize: the game had changed. The forces he was about to face weren't just powerful, they were everywhere. They watched his every move, controlled every piece on the board, and their reach extended far beyond what James could imagine. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out quickly, heart skipping a beat. The message was short, but the implication was enough to stop him cold. They know you're coming. Run. James's blood ran cold. He didn't even have time to think before the unmistakable sound of tires screeching filled the air. A black car turned the corner up ahead, headlights blinding in the darkness. His pulse quickened. They were here. The message had been clear, they knew. He was no longer a pawn in this game. He was a target. Without a second thought, James turned on his heel and bolted. His heart raced as adrenaline coursed through his veins, pushing him forward faster than he thought possible. He could hear the car speeding toward him, tires skidding as it made a sharp turn. The sound grew louder, closer. He couldn't outrun them, not like this. They had the upper hand, they always had. But he wasn't going down without a fight. Not now. He veered into a narrow alley, hoping to lose the car, to find some kind of cover. He glanced behind him but saw only the shadows of the vehicle closing in. He had no choice but to keep running, to keep moving forward, even if it meant running straight into the lion's den. The alley seemed to stretch on forever. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning with each step, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. James rounded another corner, nearly stumbling over his own feet, but when he looked up, something caught his eye, a figure standing in the shadows, waiting. The moment he saw them, his heart skipped a beat. It was Evelyn. She had followed him. But the look in her eyes wasn't the one he was used to. It wasn't fear, or concern, or even sorrow. No, this was something else, something darker. She wasn't here to save him anymore. She was here for something else. As she stepped forward, a cold smile playing at the corners of her lips, James's stomach sank. "You should have listened, James," she said, her voice low and deadly. "You had your chance." The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Evelyn wasn't on his side anymore. She had been playing him all along. The world around him seemed to crumble, and for the first time, James realized just how alone he truly was. The cold air felt like it was freezing James's lungs, the darkness of the alley pressing in around him. Evelyn's figure stood there, her silhouette outlined by the dim streetlights, a chilling calmness about her that made his blood run cold. This wasn't the woman he had trusted. The one who had fought beside him, shared his hopes, his fears. This was someone else entirely. "You should have listened, James," she repeated, her voice smooth, as if she was savoring every word. "But now, well, now it's too late." James's heart raced. The weight of the situation crashed down on him. Betrayed by Evelyn? The thought was unfathomable, yet the evidence stood before him like an impenetrable wall. "You've been playing me this whole time?" James asked, his voice hoarse, struggling to comprehend the reality he now faced. "Is this why you've been so distant? You've been working against me?" Evelyn didn't flinch. She stepped closer, each movement deliberate, calculated, like she was savoring this moment. "It was never about you, James. It was always about survival. You think you're some sort of hero, some knight in shining armor? The truth is, you're just another pawn in this game. You were useful, but now, you're a liability." The words hit James harder than any physical blow could have. A liability? All this time, all the sacrifices, the risks he had taken, and it had been for nothing. She had been using him to achieve her own goals. All his belief, his trust, had been a lie. His pulse thundered in his ears. He could feel the edges of his vision darkening, the reality of betrayal settling over him like a weight he couldn't escape. But there was still a flicker of something inside him, a spark that refused to die. "You think I'm just going to give up?" James asked, his voice gaining strength despite the storm inside him. "You think you can just walk away from this?" Evelyn's expression softened for a brief moment, almost like she was reconsidering something. But then the mask was back on, cold and unreadable. "You can keep fighting, if you want," she said, her tone almost sympathetic. "But you'll lose. You always will. You don't have the power to win this fight. Not anymore. The people you're up against? They'll destroy you. They'll make sure no one ever knows your name. No one will ever care about the truth." Her words stung, but James wasn't done yet. He wasn't about to let her rewrite his story. He wasn't about to let her destroy him, not like this. "I've already made it this far. I'm not stopping now," James said, his voice steady, unwavering. "You don't get to decide how my story ends, Evelyn. Only I do." She sighed, looking at him with pity, almost like she was sorry for him. But then her gaze hardened, and she took another step closer, her eyes gleaming with something dark and dangerous. "You're right," she said softly, almost as if to herself. "You do have a choice." James frowned, confused, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" Evelyn's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a reassuring one. It was the smile of someone who had already made up their mind. "You want to expose the truth? You want to fight? Fine. But you have to understand what that means. If you keep pushing forward, you'll be walking into a trap. And you won't survive it. But, if you choose to walk away, I can give you a way out. I can help you disappear. You won't have to worry about them anymore. You won't have to fight. You'll be free. James's mind reeled. A way out? The thought of just walking away, of leaving everything behind, seemed impossible. How could he let go of everything he had worked for? But then again, he knew she was right. No matter how much he wanted to expose the truth, no matter how much he wanted to fight for justice, the odds were stacked against him. He had no power. No allies. Only enemies, and they were closing in on him with every passing moment. He took a step back, his mind torn between two paths. Fight and likely die, or run and live, but at the cost of everything he had believed in. What was the right choice? Do you really think you can just run from this? James asked, his voice quieter now, the gravity of his decision weighing heavily on him. Do you really think they'll let you just disappear? They'll come after you, too. They'll never stop hunting you. Evelyn's eyes flickered for just a moment, a brief flash of uncertainty before it was gone. I've already made my peace with that, she said, her voice cold. I'll survive. I always have. But you? You're not as prepared as you think you are. This is your last chance. Take it or leave it. The finality in her tone made James's blood run cold. He could feel the walls closing in around him. The decision was his, but it didn't feel like a decision at all. There was no winning this battle. Not anymore. He looked down at his hands, the weight of the choices he had made pressing down on him. Every action, every step, had led him to this moment. It wasn't just about the truth anymore. It was about survival. The system was too big, too powerful, and he had nothing left to fight with. James took a deep breath. He didn't know if he was making the right choice. But the weight of the decision was clear. Run. All right, he said, his voice steady. I'll take your offer. Evelyn's smile was sharp, triumphant. Good. It's the only choice that matters. Before James could react, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, unmarked envelope. This is everything you need. Follow the instructions, and you'll be safe. No one will ever find you. James hesitated for a moment, then took the envelope from her, the cool paper heavy in his hands. He didn't know what was inside, but he knew it was his ticket to freedom. To survival. To a life away from this madness. He turned, the weight of his decision sitting like a stone in his chest. He didn't look back. Not even once. The days that followed felt like a blur. James followed the instructions in the envelope to the letter, each step leading him further and further from the life he had once known. The person he had been, the man who had believed in truth, in justice, was gone, replaced by someone who knew that survival was the only game that mattered. The truth would never be exposed. The corruption would remain, untouched and untouchable. And James would live the rest of his life with that knowledge, constantly wondering if he had made the right choice. But one thing was certain, he had chosen life. And in this world, that was the only victory he could claim.